The Chris Johnston Show.
Let's go!
Your number one destination for a behind-the-scenes look at the game of hockey.
Is this thing on?
Here's NHL insider Chris Johnston and host Julian McKenzie.
It's been a few days. A managerial change in Toronto. We have to get to that on today's CJ Show. Brad Treliving out as general manager. In the interim, Brandon Pridham and Ryan Hardy kind of taking over day-to-day responsibilities in the interim. There's a lot to get to about the firing. There's a lot to get to about Keith Pelley speaking after the fact. We should start with Brad. Why did this move get done now? What can you say about the last few weeks for the now ex-GM of the Toronto Maple Leafs?
Well, I mean, look, the Leafs are in the process of the biggest year-over-year decline in terms of points in franchise history. It was meant to be a season they're competing for the Stanley Cup, and instead they're in a position where everyone's tracking their lottery odds because they don't earn their first round pick if it falls beyond the top 5 selections. So, you know, it's pretty well documented what the season's been. I think with Brad Treliving, he was due to enter the final year of his contract with the Leafs next year. So they weren't going to put him in a position where he was going to be sort of a lame duck GM, we'll call it. And so there was going to be a decision one way or another. You know, in terms of why it happened now, I think that when Keith Pelley has done a pretty, what he feels anyway, is a pretty deep dive look at the operation. You know, he's interviewed people on staff, you know, including executives that worked with Treliving, but also, you know, some more, you know, I'll call them rank and file employees, you know, people down the list to get a gauge on things. He sat in on the trade deadline earlier this month, or I guess last month now in early March with the front office, and ultimately decided that he needed a change. And he said this was something that came together between him as the president and CEO of MLSE and ownership in the last few weeks. You know, I think from Brad Treliving's end of things, he wanted some certainty. Basically, if don't leave me twisting in the wind. If you're going to make a change, make a change. And if you want to keep me on, let's keep going to work. And so all the confluence of those events, you know, brought everything to a head at the start of this week. And, you know, it's one of the stranger ones in the sense that so much of, you know, by the time you get to Tuesday's press conference with Keith Pelley, I mean, most of the questions, if not all, were geared mostly to the Leafs' future. You know, I did ask one question of Pelley about, you know, he had such certainty in Treliving and Craig Berube last May, like what went wrong. That actually elicited the answer that kind of was heard around the hockey world about, you know, the train or whatever. I can't remember how he exactly framed it, but they didn't see the train coming, and the train was the Montreal Canadiens and the Sabres. Coming,
which was, yes, the Canadiens and the Sabres. We will get to that.
Right, but I'm saying like that. So he didn't really address what went wrong. He was asked a few specific questions that he kind of, you know, dodged on about, you know, maybe the breakdown in, you know, but he did say that he felt like the hockey operations department was misaligned and that, you know, it wasn't working together as it should. And, you know, that's kind of that. But there wasn't much focus, I guess, on the why, if you know what I mean. It was more already looking forward, who's going to replace Treliving. And I think it's because everyone understood the circumstances. I mean, nothing about the firing was surprising given the way the season's gone. The timing probably was maybe I'd say the biggest surprise, with it coming, you know, almost at 9:00 at night on a Monday, you know, just before the Leafs play a game in Anaheim that was, you know, maybe one of their most anticipated of the year given everything that went on. So, yeah, it's been a strange week around the Leafs, but, you know, really it's been a strange season. And, you know, when you're a team that has high expectations and you fall very, very far short of them, people lose their jobs, players get traded, and that's just a reality of this business.
Hold your fire on the Keith Pelley press conference from Tuesday, because I want to spend a sufficient amount of time on that. And before I get to questions about who could be a candidate to replace Brad, who could be a candidate, well, not even just a candidate, what could be the future for guys like Craig Berube around that team. Very quickly, we should touch off on that Leafs game that happened after the firing was announced against the Anaheim Ducks, which was their first game against Radko Gudas after the knee-on-knee collision with Austin Matthews. And then we saw all the fights. Radko Gudas was involved in one. Well, he didn't really throw a punch. But very quickly, what did you think of the response towards Radko Gudas and the Ducks? We don't have to spend that long on it, but just wanted to get that one out the way.
I thought the Leafs did what you would expect them to do. Like, they're almost in a no-win situation, because I've seen a few people say, well, you know, this is way too late and it's too performative or whatever. But I mean, let's face it, part of what we're talking about here, there is a performative aspect, right? And so I feel like had they done nothing in that game, they would have certainly had some arrows slung their way. I thought that they effectively did, what I would expect, stepped up and obviously fought Gudas, kept it going throughout the game. It was a very emotional game. There were some scrums and other incidents, and the Leafs came back and found a way to beat the Ducks. And afterwards, Leo Carlsson said we should be beating a team like that by 3, and they lost the game as it turned out. So I feel like for a team that's been questioned and wondered about where they're at, they had to feel good about that they actually beat Anaheim in both those games and had some measure of a response. They can't go back, obviously, to the moment of truth. And, I do think that will probably hang over this season. It'll be something that's remembered for a long time. I think it's, when you hear Keith Pelley or anyone else talk about culture, I think part of what he's referencing is the idea of everyone having each other's backs and having kind of the right feel around the team that maybe might produce a moment like the Gudas on Matthews, the original hit, back in early March. But, quite honestly, I think I land in the side that they did what I almost want to say, good job, essentially. I mean, this is what hockey is. Some people might not like it, but I do think they basically held their ground and made it a hard game and found a way to win. And, I know that those, we've sort of been over the tank scenarios. I'm sure there's some of the fan base that don't like to see them win, but, they did everything in that game. They played the Ducks hard and competed for the jersey. I mean, you saw even Easton Cowan jumping in again after Nylander took a hit. I do think it was the sort of the proper gauge of emotion for a team that, maybe it's getting a little easier for them now. They're 2 weeks from the end of their regular season, obviously not going to be in the playoffs. So, maybe when you get towards the end, it's easy to kind of, get up for these last final games. But, I thought they delivered a pretty good effort, especially too. The game wasn't very good on Saturday that immediately preceded that trip to Anaheim.
So that game comes after the firing, and now we go back to the GM chair, which, yes, there are 2 men in the interim there right now, but so much talk about who could ultimately succeed Brad Treliving in that spot. What are some candidates you've either thought of, spotted in recent days, people who make sense? People are obviously going to link Doug Armstrong. Jim Nill just signed an extension in Dallas, so you can scratch him off the list. But I've seen a lot of interesting names kind of thrown out there, whether they may be more data inclined, which, again, we're going to get to that. But I've seen people wonder, hey, is Chris Pronger fit for this role? Who could replace Brad Treliving and succeed him as the GM of the Toronto Maple Leafs?
Well, let's face it. It's a content field day for this name game because of the fact that it truly is a wide open search. At this stage, the Leafs and Keith Pelley specifically is working on getting, lining up the right search firm for them to help with the process in terms of identifying and perhaps vetting candidates. And, he has said it's wide open, that they will consider a whole host of things, right down to the fact that we might be talking about them hiring a GM president, someone who has a dual role, or perhaps it's 2 people, or, the structure is something that the Leafs, are even flexible on as they begin this process. And, the most interesting thing I heard from Pelley, and don't worry, I'm going to tie this to your question. Mm-hmm. Without being prompted, he said, really one of the non-negotiables is someone who's data centric, that's going to be an important aspect of how this front office is run. And I think there's a few ways to interpret that. I mean, there's one Eric Tulsky, right? This guy literally, I think there's a lot of people that work in hockey that are data curious, I'll call it, that have a lot of time for it, but maybe don't actually have the data background themselves. And so that, I think those type of people would be included in this statement. If you take it literally, there's not a lot of Tulskys in terms of someone who has, extensive front office experience. In this case, as the GM of the Carolina Hurricanes, but also literally worked in data, right? He had, he was an Ivy League scientist before he ever got into the hockey business. So, I think that it could end up being a broad range of people when it comes to the data portion. But then on top of that, Keith Pelley did talk about there's got to be people with strong hockey backgrounds in this front office as well. So basically it runs the gamut of what we'll call more traditional hires, as possibilities, guys like Doug Armstrong, perhaps a Chris Pronger. Obviously he's been pretty front and center. He released a book. And so he's been doing a lot of media, and I think he's maybe top of mind because of that. you know, you got Kevin Adams, who was obviously let go in Buffalo, and I think he's looked a lot better effectively since he left Buffalo, just because the Sabres have done nothing but win. They've already crested 100 points and are going to end their long playoff drought here. So, you know, that's a name that's out there. But then, you know, you get into some of the more interesting ones, like would the Leafs look at Sonny Maeda, you know, who's an analytic mind and assistant GM with the Florida Panthers. You know, you could look at any number, you know, I don't know where they go with the data. Like, I almost am hesitant to throw out too many names because this is me talking. Like, you know, I know there's a lot of people in the industry think great things about Evan Gold, who's an assistant GM in Boston. You've got guys like Tyler Dello in Carolina as an assistant GM, obviously, you know, also has worked in the media world and been around the game a long time. Like, there's a lot of different ways they could go with the data component. And, you know, I wonder if it could even include someone who's not necessarily working in hockey right now. You know, not a perfect comparison, but the Colorado Rockies in the Major League Baseball went and hired Paul D. Podesta from the NFL. And I know he'd worked in baseball prior, was involved in Moneyball, the original Billy Bean days with Oakland. But, you know, I would think when you're engaging the kind of search firm the Leafs are going to, you know, they're going to look at a range of possibilities here. And so anyone whose name I haven't mentioned, I'm not purposely trying to punt on the question. I think that we could be talking about just a huge swath of potential options here. And you know, I'm going to operate on the assumption this ends up, until I hear otherwise, that it probably is going to end up as two people. You know, I think one way to satisfy the data component of what Keith Pelley was looking for is to have an experienced sort of president above that person. Because I think it does make it more comfortable for the Leafs potentially to hire someone who's a first-time general manager in the NHL. You know, you can maybe have someone who's a little younger, more familiar with where specifically, you know, data concepts are going and how it might be used moving forward. You know, not a reverse-looking view of what could be done. And then you have someone potentially above them. You know, this is where you talk about the Mike Gillises. You know, his name certainly has been out there around this kind of opening. You know, where they could maybe lead that person because they have a lot of real world experience in terms of, you know, having been in the GM's chair all those years ago in Vancouver. So, you know, I think that this could take on a lot of different forms. And so it's a great open-ended, clicky, you know, topic, because I think we could really toss out 30 or 40 names and they're all, at least at this stage, like nothing's been ruled out. You know, I asked Keith Pelley directly if the Leafs had sought permission from another team to talk to anyone. At this point, they haven't. So, you know, that doesn't preclude them obviously from talking to someone like a Mike Gillis who isn't employed anywhere. But, you know, really it just emphasizes that we truly are at the beginning stages of this process, and it's going to have to move quickly. I mean, ideally, Pelley called it his nirvana would be getting this hire or hires done by mid-May. You know, we're sitting here right at the start of April. Like, that's 6-7 weeks. That it's a lot of time if you end up working through a number of candidates. Obviously, you know, this is probably where the search firm can help out in terms of maybe doing some preliminary type of interviews so that it's not necessarily Pelley himself, you know, sitting down with 30 different candidates or whatever the number ends up being. But yeah, the Leafs are operating on a pretty accelerated time frame. And I think, you know, to loop it back to the original question about why now for Treliving, you know, if they'd reached the decision they weren't going to continue on with them beyond the season, you know, for his own sake, there's a positive, you know, I think by cutting ties when they did, but also it does give them an extra 2 weeks of time to get going on the formal search. And you know, those are an important 2 weeks because while the off season will feel long for fans of the team and some of the players, behind the scenes, a lot has to happen this summer in Toronto and elsewhere. And, you know, effectively, while there's still a handful of games left, you know, they're already on the next season operationally and how they're thinking.
Forgive my ignorance as an outsider here, but with the way that you're describing what the Leafs might want to do or what might be ideal for them when this dust settles around the GM search, kind of sounds like they're trying to look for a Shanaplan 2.0, like someone who's a little bit younger and more data inclined as a GM, and then someone who's older, has much more experience around the league and the NHL who kind of oversees them. They literally had this structure not that long ago. And, well, it didn't work out as well as they would have wanted to. I'm not saying that, like,
but it wasn't.
They can't go back to that well, and there are obviously some subtle differences. That's just my immediate takeaway from that.
Sure, and I'm not going to defend what the Leafs have been for the last 10 years, but anyone who wants to say it didn't work with Kyle Dubas, I think is purposely obfuscating the truth. Like, they had an 115 point season with him as GM. They had an 111 point season with him as GM. A couple of the other years were interrupted by COVID, so that, the point totals aren't as, important here, but it did work until it didn't, I would say. And I think you're right to point out, they're looking for something similar to that. They're looking perhaps for someone like Dubas. If you think of archetypes, like, I'm not saying exactly Dubas or exactly Shanahan, but they're kind of looking for that setup. Quite honestly, if you think about where they've gone from, if we back it up even further than that, it's almost like a pendulum swinging back and forth. At one point They had Lou Lamoriello as a GM, obviously very traditional, very accomplished, very well respected guy. But you wouldn't think of him as forward facing. They when there was a decision to be made there's a chance Dubas could have left at the time. Instead, they promote Dubas to GM. Lamoriello's out. So they go a little bit more, whatever, forward facing, whatever you want to call this, younger. Then when Dubas and Shanahan have their big split in 2023, first thing Brendan Shanahan says, we need an experienced GM, which, it was a pretty narrow field at the time. It led them effectively straight to Brad Treliving. They did speak to Mark Bergevin at that point in time, but it swings back to the more traditional mold. And it seems now that they're looking for a little bit, to move in the other direction. I don't think any of this is bad in and of itself. It might, it could end up, I guess, influencing what other candidates might want to do. Do some of the more traditional candidates hear what Keith Pelley said in terms of what he's looking for and think, that might not be for me? I do think there's an element of that. I've had that suggested to me, that some of the more traditional candidates might not be on board for what the setup looks like. I mean, and that's where this will get compelling. I think once we truly get a sense of who they're interviewing and where things are headed, that'll be part of it. But, at the end of the day, this is still the Toronto Maple Leafs. I realize they're not in a great spot in the standings. They've got a lot of challenges in terms of roster construction. They've got an ownership group that clearly doesn't want to rebuild at this stage. That was an obvious takeaway to have from Keith Pelley's press conference, is that they're more trying to do this on the fly versus thinking about blowing everything up at this point in time. So there's a lot of there's definitely, don't get me wrong, the wind's in your face a little bit here, but it's still the GM job of the Maple Leafs and potentially a president's job of the Maple Leafs. I mean, there's going to be a whole ton of interest in this. And I do believe Keith Pelley is open-minded about what it ends up looking like.
We're slowly transitioning into that press conference, but
I'm trying to drag you there. It was a pretty interesting day.
I can't wait to hear more about it. But just as a way to kind of wait our feet in, the idea that Keith Pelley and the Leafs do not want a scorched earth rebuild, and they feel they have the foundational pieces with their squad. Is that the right way to approach this? Is that the right way to go about it, or do the Leafs have their head in the sand?
It's a fair question. I think there's a mix. There definitely, from the people I've spoken with, there are some people that say 100% they need to rebuild this, that delaying decisions isn't going to help anything. Like putting it off and trying to, basically make it work on with duct tape and whatever else you're doing to the roster right now is not going to get you any closer to winning a Stanley Cup. And all it's doing is pushing everything back a year. Maybe it's reducing what you might get if you were willing to trade, some of the most attractive players on the team and those sorts of things. But, at the end of the day, it really feels like ownership isn't ready to, they're not ready for anyone to come in the door and say, here's the plan. Our next playoff game's in 2032. Like they're not ready to hear that. They're not ready to contemplate that. Let's keep in mind, Rogers now owns the majority of the Maple Leafs and MLSE, the Raptors, TFC, the Toronto Argonauts, what have you. Rogers owns Sportsnet, which has the national television rights in Canada to show playoff games and other games. But, they're making more money on that enterprise when the Leafs are good and when the Leafs are playing playoff hockey. They like the gate revenue. I've been told the Leafs playoff gate is roughly $10 million a game in terms of just net profit that comes in the door. So, let's do some quick math here. They played against Ottawa. They played 3 home games, and against Florida, they played 4 home games last year. So last spring, if my numbers, which I'm sourcing are close to correct, like they brought in $70 million extra dollars. Think about it.
It's enough to buy a lot of things.
But even with the salary cap jumping in the league to $104 million, like that's that's covering the biggest operational cost for any pro sports franchise is the salaries of the players. There's tons of other costs, travel, huge staff, everything else. But the point is that, that's a pretty nice return on investment, because in addition to that cash flow that continues in, obviously the value of these franchises is skyrocketing by the year. I mean, the real play for a company like Rogers or whoever owns sports teams is just holding it over time, because, all of a sudden a 1 billion team is now a 2 billion, is a 4 billion, is a 7 billion. Like, it's going in a very good direction. But back to the point, I just don't think that as at this moment, the key people making the call, like the people even above Keith Pelley, I don't think they want anything to do with the idea that you're trading away Matthews, you're trading away Nylander, and whatever else, and it's going to be 5-6 years most likely. I mean, and that's optimistic, right? Look what's going on right now. The Detroit Red Wings are approaching 10 years out of the playoffs, and unfortunately for them, currently sliding in the wrong direction in terms of that playoff race. So it can be even much, much longer. And so that's going to be something that however the dust settles on this, that's going to be an interesting kind of dynamic to watch. I wonder if it takes anyone out of play here, because as I say, I know that there's the view of some executives that may be in line to interview here that think there's really no way around it. Like, you just got to jump, like the quicker you get on the rebuild, the deconstruction of this roster, the better. That's something to consider. The other thing I'll put in your ear, though, the weirdest thing of all here is I'm not sure any executive, I'm not sure any owner really controls what's going to happen. I mean, who has more power right now around the Leafs than Austin Matthews? He's got a no movement clause in his contract. He's, even coming off 2 down seasons or 2 seasons where he's been injured and his production's been down, he's still in the prime of his career. He's got 2 years left on his deal. Like, whether he says he wants to come back or not, I think that's going to set the direction almost in and of itself, at least for another year. There's definitely a lot of challenges here that are kind of difficult to get around. But then, the one thing I'll say, I'm not predicting the Leafs can immediately be a contender next year. Like, I really think that's a stretch. But I look at the playoffs as we enter play Wednesday night. The Winnipeg Jets are 1 point back in the West of a wild card spot. The Winnipeg Jets are also 1 point back of the Toronto Maple Leafs in the overall standings. And, I don't want to waste too much time on the if they were here and there, because they're not. But I guess I would say to you, even in a really bad year in Toronto, how far are they off the middle point of the league? I don't think they're that far off. They're probably middle of the pack team. I realize they're a little lower than that in points percentage, but isn't the counterpoint to that, like, the Jets are in the West, and yes, they're in a race, but that race for that second wildcard spot in the Western Conference is much lower quality compared to what you're seeing in the Eastern Conference, where, Detroit's on a bit of a slide, but that's a team that's knocking on the door. The Islanders have a super rookie in Matthew Schaefer also up there. If the Penguins fall a little bit, that's still a team that's producing well with veterans at the top. The Senators are a team that's trying to get back into the playoffs. The Philadelphia Flyers are also but this is a year where it couldn't have gone worse for Toronto. Like, they have had injuries, terrible performances from key people, like the whole thing. And if you look, like, I'm just saying.
And that's after they traded that star winger they had, who had a 100-point season, who is now in Vegas.
Sure, but look at where the Florida Panthers were before Bill Zito got there. Like, that's obviously, like, a lot of things went right, but he got there and he made a whole bunch of good moves, and they became, a team that could win a cup pretty soon. I'm not predicting that's definitely going to happen for the Leafs, but I could see why the temptation is there. I mean, Austin Matthews still isn't 30. Like, if you tell me we come back next season and Austin Matthews scores 50 goals again, which is not insane, if, this is where we're getting into bigger ifs. If Chris Tanev is healthy again, because I think he was low-key the Leafs MVP last season. He really changed, what they could do with their blue line. If they get consistent goaltending, which could happen, and if whoever is hired or which people are hired makes a couple other good moves, like, I'm not going to say they're battling for the President's Trophy. I don't think that's in the cards, but certainly back to being a playoff team is, and so it's hard to blow it up, Julian, because the easiest thing to say is blow it up, but you need at minimum to win a cup. You need a true number one center. I think you need a number one defenseman, which the Leafs don't have, but they have the number one center. Like, if you trade Matthews, you're going to spend the next 10 years looking for something even like close to that and probably not finding it. So
you could, but depending on what team you trade with, though. And I realize I am maybe making the argument for Austin Matthews. I don't know if I necessarily agree with it, but if you are on that position where you're going to move on from Austin Matthews, maybe you get lottery balls that can get you closer to that number one overall pick or a top pick one day. That could be an Austin Matthews, and maybe other pieces that could help your team for the future. That being said, we don't know how long rebuilds take. There's no 3-year set thing.
The odds of finding another Matthews are preposterously long.
You're right.
And then finding a Connor McDavid, it's even longer than that. But like, you have to win the lottery, which is already like, it's a real long shot. And then you have to do it in a year where there's someone who's going to be that good. And draft ridiculously well and find your game-changing talent at 15th overall in the first round. The Leafs, it's funny. I'm not sure they've even drafted poorly. Like, they've traded away a lot of picks and a few prospects, but they found Matthew Nyes in the second round. Now, that was Kyle Dubas' draft. He was a nice present left over when he left Toronto for the next, regime here. And then they've since extended Nyes to what I think should be a pretty good contract and a long-term one in a rising cap environment. But the Leafs have, you always wish there was more, any team, but they've actually still found a few guys. Even Easton Cowan is starting to look like a player. And, this is in the era where they're not drafting in the top 10 or 15. Anyway, I'm getting diverted a little here.
No,
they definitely need an injection they need an injection of youth. They need an injection of draft capital. They need an injection of prospects, and they need more players. So, but I don't know that it's impossible. It's maybe improbable, but I certainly think that there might be more certainty trying to go for it a little longer than just getting rid of everything right now, because I don't think you're winning those trades, quite honestly. Like, you're going to get a bunch of stuff if you start trading those core pieces, but it might take like 10 more years of losing to even, accumulate anything that's worth getting. Rebuilds are tough. Like, I think I said this last show, so I'm going to be repeating myself, but Chicago, man, like, and they got Connor Bedard, like, that's amazing. And Frundell just scored his first NHL goal. Like, they got reason to be excited there, good. But they're still been a long way from being competitive. Like, when's the last meaningful game the Blackhawks have played? Like, it's like a decade ago. Maybe not entirely fair. They did make the COVID bubble and the expanded 2014 playoffs, but beyond that, it's been a long, long, long time for an organization that had it as well as anyone, right? They win 3 cups in a 6-year period. It was a pretty good time between about 2008 and 2015-16 in Chicago, but then it's been a pretty lean 10 years since. So there's no perfect plan, but you're right. They're looking for a plan. They're looking for people to come in with a vision and a way that they can turn this thing around quickly, and we'll see if they can accomplish that.
Let's move on to the train comment from Keith Pelley. The quote, as CJ mentioned, quote, heard around the hockey world. Without going into detail, we didn't have the culture or the structure that we needed to be successful. We definitely didn't see the train coming, meaning the Buffalo Sabres and the Montreal Canadiens, and how strong those two teams are, along with the likes of Detroit and Ottawa. Detroit, I get it. They've been out of the playoffs for the last how many years? They did make some moves, though. So you had to at least think like, okay, maybe this is the year they crack it open and make the playoffs.
This is Keith Pelley's quote. He's not speaking.
I want to.
For like Brad Treliving obviously knew the Canadiens made the playoffs last year with one of the youngest rosters in the league, if not the youngest.
They still made the playoffs. I'm sorry.
No, but he's not speaking for them. He's speaking for himself. Like, this guy is not supposed to be a hockey expert.
If you're involved with the Toronto Maple Leafs, I don't care if you were working in golf and TV before. You are working for one of the most known hockey franchises the sport has ever produced. You better figure some shit out about what you know about the league and all that. Or at the very least, don't say that. I'm sorry. I think that's unacceptable to step up and be like, hey, man, I didn't see the Montreal Canadiens who were in the playoffs last year. And I get and before you cut me off here, I know the 2021 Cup run is COVID.
No, I'm not even saying all that.
I know. No. But let me finish. I understand all of that around it. But there are two players from that Montreal Canadiens team who are still on that Canadiens team now who are getting playoff experience and have had way more playoff experience than some of the Toronto Maple Leafs on this team right now. And I'm talking about Nick Suzuki and Cole Caulfield. Stepping up in front of people, I don't care if you're the president, whatever job you're Keith Pelley, and being like, hey man, I really didn't see the Montreal Canadiens coming. That's very laughable. I think that's bad. I don't agree with that comment. Like, you shouldn't say that.
Dude, I'm not defending him. I guess I'm
not saying you're defending him.
My point is, like, I just don't know if it matters. Like, it's not a good look. Like, to me, there was a number of what I would call sort of PR missteps in that, 37 minutes, give or take, that Pelley was in front of a microphone on Tuesday. Like, there was a number of, that would be the top comment. Like, that would be your number one takeaway. If you were at the press conference and then you saw your best buddy when you walked outside, you met him for coffee and he's like, hey, what was that? You would go like, dude, did you hear what he said? And then
that's on the marquee.
Exactly. So but I guess it's just not, you're right. He represents the organization in that moment. That's going to be a meme now, the choo-choo train with the CH.
Bruh, like, I'm sorry. Like, if you represent the Toronto Maple Leafs in that role and you say that comment, you are going to be looked at as out of touch. And I get it. You're not the GM who should be much more in tune with who's good in the league. But, like, it's still, I don't think you could say that. Or at least I don't want to know, if I'm a Leafs fan, that the guy who's overseeing all of this doesn't realize that some of his division rivals are much closer to his team than he thinks. Like, that scares me if I'm a fan of this team, that he didn't know that the Canadiens would be that close. The Sabres, I get it. They've been on the mat. Like, people have been waiting for this team to play well. And then Detroit and Ottawa, those teams, again, knocking on the door. Like, but if anything, if I'm in that role, I'm like, what if those teams make that jump? Like, it's a warning light, but there's still, if Keith Pelley hires the right people and lets them do their job, I mean, they can tell him what he needs to worry about. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, they're not going to him and saying like, hey, which division rival are you thinking could upend our season? He also said we. He didn't say I. He didn't say I didn't see it, or man, Brad Treliving told me different, or Brandon Pridham told me different, but I saw it differently. Yes.
And I'm not carrying any water here. I can assure you the Montreal Canadiens didn't take Brad Treliving. They didn't catch Brad Treliving off guard. Or anyone in that hockey operations department. Like,
yeah.
We can criticize a trade, but like, let's be real here. I think it's been pretty clear that Montreal's been on the climb, and the Atlantic Division's been a difficult division for a number of seasons. It's getting even harder because of what Pelley's highlighting, that when the Sabres in Montreal break through where you're at, like, okay, these teams are here now. Like, it's not even a question of what you're going to get from year to year. Like, they're just established, with frontline talent up and down, and, young players coming, and, then the challenge is harder. So I don't know. It was a bad comment. I might have tweeted that within 12 seconds of hearing it, because I knew what that was. But I still think, weirdly, like, the more I've been on, really ruminated this whole press availability, as bad as, like, you might say he lost the press conference, like, I think that's fair. And it's been pretty widely panned, I think, at this point. I still don't necessarily think it's bad for the Leafs, like, the way he's thinking. And look, there's a lot of people out there in the hockey world that are thinking that, oh, wow, this is going to be a disaster. And we'll see. But, like, I'll tell you, I got one text from someone who works for another team, doesn't have any stake in this, isn't looking for a job. Just like, I was like, hey, what'd you think? And he's like, I'm here for it in the short term. They could actually do something good. I would be worried about how much he wants his paws on everything, though, he being Pelley. But it's a fair take. Like I think the idea of looking for maybe not just recycling only a hockey person or traditional person, trying to find new ways to be better and innovative. Like, obviously every team wants to do that, but it's hard to do it when you have a lot of established people in place. When you're making this kind of change, it does bring forward the possibility of, updating your processes and functioning better. Right. So, considering different types of candidates like that all should, I think that should be encouraging to Leafs fans. I'm not saying they're going to make the right decision. Who knows? But the fact, like, I was legitimately surprised with the way that press conference went. And I don't mean some of those comments that are rightfully just sitting there for us to just, hammer and hammer and hammer. But I thought we were going to get more of a look. A lot of people went into this thinking Doug Armstrong's job, right? And look, he could still end up there. But I think a lot of people were thinking that they were going to say, we need someone really established. We need someone with, absolute credentials, which obviously Doug Armstrong has, a Stanley Cup winner, Team Canada GM multiple times, someone who's been in the NHL, I think 25 odd years as a GM between Dallas and his long time now in St. Louis. I mean, I thought that it was going to be telemarked that they're looking for him. It wasn't telemarked that way. Right. And so I think it's interesting that they're, Keith Pelley's a disruptor. I think that's the one thing everyone has to keep in mind. And it's not a defense of the guy, but I think context is important. He gets ripped for that press conference by a lot of people that are expecting a sports press conference to go a certain way. I mean, he's speaking in business terms. I get it. A lot of people don't like the buzzwords. Their brains turn off. They're like, this is mumbo jumbo. But I mean, that's the way business is done. He works for a big corporate monolith, like he works for some of the wealthiest people in the entire country. And so he's got to operate on their level. And, he's always been someone who makes the people that work under him a little uncomfortable because he wants to not have any sort of lethargy, set into an organization. He wants to challenge the way you think and do things. And that's clearly what's happening with the Leafs. Like I can tell you there's a lot of unhappy people that work for the Leafs right now. And it's not just because Brad Treliving's just been fired and he's, a pretty well-liked guy. It's that there's been a long shadow over their operation this year. And a lot of people I think are uncomfortable with Pelley's level of involvement. But that's by design. Like it's one thing, those people can be uncomfortable. Like he wants them to do things differently. And so he can be a challenging person. I think he gets it at a press conference like Tuesday. I honestly think he's got 0 F's to give, man. And again, it's not a defense. I just think we should consider what he's trying to accomplish. He's trying to, in his mind, drag this huge corporation into the future and try to find ways that the Leafs can use their resources to basically have an advantage over a lot of their competition, to be run better, to be run differently. He's mentioning artificial intelligence at a press conference like that, without being asked.
That was, can I just say, AI is a tool that we have to learn to use in tandem with everything and not have it dominate everything. But I did think it was a little weird how that was placed, where he gets asked, I believe it was your question.
It was my question.
Where you asked to kind of go in more on having a data-centric GM, and then he kind of just randomly mentions AI and then tries to circle back. I did think that was a little weird.
Yeah, I mean, look, it was not, that specific quote especially was kind of all over the place. Because I had mentioned Eric Tulsky in my question. I asked something to the effect of, following up on you're looking for someone data centric. There's really one data centric GM in the league right now, and he's very much employed in Carolina, Eric Tulsky. So does that mean you're willing to basically employ a first time GM? Because to get someone with those capabilities, there's just not a lot of experienced people. And he answered yes, but then he also, had a lot of nice things to say about Eric. He mentioned AI. He mentioned that, everybody's dealing with more and more data. The NHL has gone to player and puck tracking. There's more and more advances each year in terms of what the teams get. And Keith's point seemed to be, we got to get ahead on, basically cycling through that data, taking the right pieces out of it, that in a more efficient and effective way than our competition. Toronto's also done this with TFC. They've gone very much in a very data heavy format with some recent changes they made in the front office. This is the way of MLSE, whether anyone likes it or not. I don't know how it's going to work. There's obviously a lot of skeptics. Some people always, it's easy to, I guess, just sort of throw it around there like AI. It's gonna be massive. He said it's gonna be massive for our business. I don't know how, but I don't pretend to be a visionary with this stuff either. I mean, I am aware enough that more and more companies are using it as a way to be more efficient and effective. And it does stand to reason that there would be ways for it to help in pro sports. And I don't think it's bad that the Leafs are looking, or any other team would be looking for those advantages. I mean, it's in a capped world. The Leafs have obviously spent a lot more on their front office than most teams with 6 assistant GMs. I saw a lot of people highlighting that fact, but also, some teams do operate on pretty small budgets and they would have a budget to do this stuff. I think it's right that they're looking for that kind of edge, but whether or not they can achieve it and whether he's the right guy to get there, I mean, that's all to be determined here. I mean, Keith Pelley's been on the job 2 years and, it's not all his mess, but his hands aren't clean here, right? He made the decision to not renew Brendan Shanahan, to go without a president, and then look what's happened. All of a sudden, now the GM he was so sure about, he's fired within 10 months. Like there's legitimate questions about whether he's the right person to keep leading this, but seems that he has the confidence of his bosses to at least be around for this next bit of hirings that he's called the most important of his career.
Before we get to stick taps, any other takeaways from the press conference that you'd like to get to that I didn't ask you?
I think that it's a really interesting time for this organization. Things have felt pretty settled for a long time. I know it's the Leafs and there's always, mini crises, we'll call them from time to, there's a lot of things that flare up and become storylines, but they had a lot of continuity with Brendan Shanahan in the presidency as long as he was. There's been some changes at GM. They've flipped coaches, but it was a pretty steady period. And they had even that core four, as much time ink was spilled on them. They had those players all signed long-term. Like the sort of spine of the operation has been pretty clear, certain for a long time. And maybe this was natural when you have, Marner leave and, everyone's getting a little older. That right now, it feels like it still feels like it could go in a bunch of directions. And then you add in Pelley, who's clearly a wild card, right? He's unpredictable. Even that he mentioned data centric, I guess one point I didn't make is that's not an area the Leafs have been criticized for. Like it almost felt like going back in time. And Julian, this will sound like a history lesson to you because you were probably in high school when this happened. But there was a point, for those that might forget, when the Leafs were run with Dave Nonis as the GM, and really the 2013 lockout shortened season was analytics were becoming more and more of a thing. They were crossing over from like a niche to teams were starting to integrate them. There's a lot of analysts out there. Most of them now work for teams, but at that time, a lot of them were in the blogosphere. And they were pointing out that a team like the Leafs that year were basically unsustainably winning games. That to simplify it, they were getting outshot and outchanced most nights, but using either a combination of shooting luck or great goaltending or specialty teams to win more than they should. And, it became a little bit of a back and forth. And, the Leafs ended up making the playoffs. Obviously, that was the team that blew the 4-1 lead in Game 7 against Boston. But, around that same time, Dave Nonis at one point was actually at a conference, and he mentioned that the Leafs had an analytics budget, but they effectively didn't know where to spend it. And this is a long time ago, 12, 13 years ago, and people lost their minds, right? And ultimately, that kind of reaction and that the sort of the understanding that the organization was behind, that's what led to Kyle Dubas initially being hired as an assistant GM in 2014. Kyle he actually had a pretty traditional hockey background in that he was a scout and an agent, and he ran the Sault Ste. Marie Greyhounds. What was uncommon is he was 29 years old, and they hired him and brought him in to be sort of the face of like, hey, this guy's going to modernize us. He understands the numbers. He's into it. And, they set out and built an analytics department, and that's kept running this entire time. And so really, in my mind, since 2014, 2015, no one said, hey, the Leafs are crappy because they're not taking these numbers seriously, right? I mean, and to this day, they have a guy named Daryl Metcalf, and he's been there for a long time. He was hired by Dubas. He's an assistant GM on this team. He runs a department that has analysts and that do presumably, like, look, a lot of this stuff is in-house. I don't know how, I can't personally compare it to what other teams do, but I've never heard it raised as like, hey, the Leafs are way behind here. So the fact that Keith Pelley raised this sort of out of the blue, like that really caught my ear at the time. Cause like, I'm wondering, was it an issue where the research and development program that's producing these numbers wasn't being listened to? Is it that simple, or does he think they need new people? I mean, I don't have an answer for that, but it was a fascinating, that's one of those press conferences. I got a weird memory, Julian, especially when it's something big, but I feel like I'm going to remember that press conference for like way into the future, just because of how many interesting moments there were and the dynamic in the room. And, we're still Keith Pelley's a known commodity in Toronto. He's, he's a sports executive. He's been a lot of our big bosses at one point in time. He's not that he's new to the market, but that's only about the third time he's spoken officially in a capacity, at a Leafs press conference. So I think everyone's still getting used to him, and he's got a unique style, man. He speaks in business terms at a sporting level, and that drives people nuts. And then he's also just prone to pull out a few lines that, people are going to be talking about that train comment, as you mentioned, for years.
Yeah.
Like, that's going to be on t-shirts or memes or whatever. Like, the next time the Leafs and Habs are playing, I'm sure someone's going to remind the Leafs about that comment.
I'm pretty sure Steve Dangle made a joke in our group chat about him wearing a conductor's hat if he ever has to stream Canadiens games or something like that. That's pretty funny. Anyway, great job on your coverage of that press conference and of everything post firing for Brad Treliving. We're going to get to stick taps here. I'll start with mine. I'll do a stick tap for the legacy of Bill Riley, the third Black player in NHL history who unfortunately passed away over the weekend because of cancer, was teammates with the second Black player in NHL history, Mike Marson, with the Washington Capitals. Also spent some time with the Winnipeg Jets. I came across a story this week about Bill Riley. In 2017, he was watching a segment on Hockey Night in Canada about legendary Maple Leafs defenseman Bill Barilko, and there was apparently something going on with his gravestone. We know Bill Barilko unfortunately perished in a plane crash, and Bill Riley asked his daughter, who I believe was living in Timmins, to go over to the gravesite and clean that gravesite. So that was a really cool story to read, but also really sad to hear that Bill Riley is no longer with us. And I encourage people to read more about his legacy and other Black players who have come before and since Bill Riley.
He was a Maritimer, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Also coached after his playing career in the Maritime Junior A Hockey League.
Pretty cool. I mean, sorry that he's passed, but an opportunity to at least, you're right, familiarize ourselves with his legacy. I'm going to take a much more of the moment stick tap, and I'm going to give it to Macklin Celebrini. 100 points.
I like it.
As a teenager, sixth teenager in NHL history. Not a surprise because he's been on this pace for a long time. But I will say pretty impressive season for this guy. Basically, he's leading the B flight in NHL scoring, right? You've got like the superhuman McKinnon, McDavid, Kucherov, wrestling at the top. Well, this guy's going to finish fourth most likely in scoring overall, which is pretty great for someone his age, coming of age moment at the Olympics. And I thought it was neat, Julian. I don't know if you saw his post-game interview. He said that 100 points, he's not going to lie, was like something, a target he had in his mind, but he didn't think he'd get here this soon. It was something he had in mind for his career. So, I think Celebrini's really had just one of these seasons that, put him on another level, and even he's surprising himself. And I like that he was honest with that, because players usually don't like to just talk about milestones in real time. You know what I mean? Like, usually it's like, I'll appreciate this when I'm older, but I like that he's appreciating it right now.
And not too long before we consider Macklin Celebrini in the A tier and not B tier. Anyway, Siege, great stick tap, great show as always, great work as always. We could shower you with praise as much as we want to, but we only have so much time to do these episodes. Subscribe to the podcast if you haven't done so already, whether through the SDPN YouTube channel or Spotify or whatever podcatcher you use. Get your questions in for the next Ask CJ at the start of next week. You can ask CJ literally anything. If your team could be making some moves in the offseason, if you have more questions about the press conference Keith Pelley had a couple days ago, anything, we'll try to get to as many as we can. Siege, great work. We'll chat with you all very soon.
The Chris Johnston Show. Follow Chris on Twitter @ReporterChris and follow Julian @JKA McKenzie.
The Chris Johnston Show.
Hey, did you like the thing you just watched?
Was it hilarious? Was it informative? Was it me losing my mind?
Possibly. Potentially. Most of the time it is. Hey, listen, if you like what SDPN has to offer, you should check out more of our videos and subscribe to our channel by clicking subscribe, or Steve will find you.